Good evening, everyone. Good morning to our viewers in Hong Kong, uh, and good afternoon or evening to our viewers in the United States, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm David Goldman, Deputy Editor of the Asia Times, and my colleagues and I are deeply honored to welcome a distinguished panel of experts on China, and particularly grateful to the Asia Society and the 21st Century China Center of University of California, San Diego. These organizations co-sponsored one of the most informative, sophisticated, as well as commonsensical pieces of writing on China we've had for quite some time, entitled Meeting the China Challenge. This report came out at the end of last year, and we're honored to have four of its co-authors with us in alphabetical order. Let me introduce Peter Cowie, who's Dean of the School of Policy and Strategy at the University of California at San Diego. Peter Michelson, Professor of Physics at Stanford University. Susan Shirk, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Chair of the 21st Century China Center at University of California, San Diego, and Helen Toner, Director of Strategy for Security and Emerging Technology at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. An important think tank about which we'll have more to say. Ladies and gentlemen, Asia Times is honored by your presence and deeply grateful for your participation. The question before us is, as you asked in your report, can we meet the China challenge? I think our listeners are eager to hear what you have to say, and particularly eager about your thoughts on U.S.-China relations since you published the report with the beginnings of a new administration. So what order shall we proceed? Dean Cowie, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thanks very much, David, for the opportunity to meet with you and the audience that is gathered for this webinar. Let me say a word about the report itself. It was the result of a year of intense work by a group of experts gathered from, of course, universities like our own, but also from leading think tanks, business executives in the technology field, and also retired U.S. government officials. The work of the group really emerged as a result of a deep conversation where ideas were challenged across all sectors from the different starting perspectives of the members of the group. And we were looking at, from a U.S. perspective at two issues involving the relationship between the U.S. and China in science and technology in the 21st century. One was, of course, the issue of security implications of that relationship, and the other was involving the economic competitiveness of the United States. Those issues, in turn, forced us to sort of sit down and ask, what are some fundamental first principles that should inform a U.S. policy? And we use slightly more formal language in the report, but let me articulate three principles informally. The first principle was simply heal yourself. In the judgment of our group, many of the tensions between the US and China on science and technology relations were significantly worse and harder to resolve because the United States had not done its own homework in keeping up its leadership in science and technology, ranging from basic research, as you'll hear Peter Michelson talk about, through applied technology deployment and innovation. So fixing that problem was key to everything else in our view. The second issue was simply that the requirement of dealing with what are real issues about security and competitiveness demanded a system of very sophisticated risk management, one where problems were much more carefully defined than is often found, if you'll excuse me, David, in the press, and where solutions are really pinpointed, and most importantly, in the realm of science and technology, driven by a notion from hockey that you skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is or it has been. You have to look at the medium and long-term drivers of the science and technology to really understand where the most significant problems are and where the right set of solutions are possible. And the third principle was simply that interdependence in the global science and technology innovation system was valuable and not really capable of being abandoned. Yes, you can modify it through risk management. Yes, you can damage it by thoughtless action. But in the end, we are seeing a world driven by the creation of new knowledge and technology. And to the benefit of the world, that creation of knowledge and technology is spreading beyond the traditional confines of the US and Europe and Japan, and now China as a driver, but to broader expanses of the world. And keeping that ecosystem alive and nourishing progress for the world is an important value in policy design. So those three principles drove the analysis. I'll talk for a minute or so about one of the hottest issues in the relationship, 5G, just to briefly illustrate those principles. In 5G, of course, in the United States, under the Trump administration, front and center was the concern about Huawei's rising importance in the global digital technology space, and particularly its leadership in the commercial sale and deployment of the network infrastructure equipment for 5G. That problem was identified to be a security risk in the mind of the Trump administration and a challenge to American technological leadership in digital technology. For the moment, I'm going to put aside the issues about security involving Huawei equipment. Our observation was that there are legitimate questions that have been raised about that security problem, and there are measures that could respond to that problem. But what was also true is that Huawei equipment is going to be substantially deployed around the world. And in a world where Huawei equipment is substantially deployed, there are going to be data flows and applications that are interdependent, that is going to see flows across national borders. So you can't respond to any worry you have about Huawei simply by excluding it from your own national network. The bigger story about Huawei, in light of the point that we've made about skating to where the puck is going and technology trends, was that we're really at an internet moment in 5G. The initial deployment of 5G is not radically different in its implications from 4G. It's somewhat faster. After you're done with that, not much different initially. But in the longer term, 5G and its successors opens the door to a truly massive Internet of Things with broad new applications that we have not yet even dreamt up, and which will be, most importantly, available everywhere on demand. And that is the key to the 5G technology, that suddenly networks can be redeployed, reconfigured on demand to specific needs anywhere you are, virtually instantly. And in that world, with the growth of an Internet of Things globally at a massive level, there comes to be a whole new set of security problems, which is the security of the Internet of Things ecosystem empowered by 5G. And it's there that the security problem in the long term may include Huawei, but it goes far beyond Huawei, and a security strategy has to be found there. Now, the other point that I just want to make here about economic competitiveness is that I said that this is an internet moment. And I mean it in an analogy to think of computing or telecom networks in the 1980s and the early 1990s. You'll recall then that the worry in the United States was that Japan was going to dislodge IBM or AT&T from their leadership roles in those areas. But the debate was wrong because, in fact, what was coming was a whole new architecture called the internet that changed entirely what the source of competitive advantage was. Instead of IBM leading the computing world, Intel, Microsoft, in communications, Cisco with routers, a notion that didn't really exist in the 1980s, became extremely strong. And so that became the basis for a shift in competitive advantage. And our view about 5G is that moment is coming in 5G, but government policy is going to play an important role in being the incubator and the nudge to switch these architectures and change the competitive landscape.
Peter, I want to talk about this stuff all night, and that's fascinating. In the interest of time, can we give the floor to Professor Michelson? I'll come back though. I have some questions, please.
I have to turn my microphone on. So thank you very much, David. I'm going to talk about the perspective I've gained from participating in the working group over the last couple of years. And my perspective comes from basically what's called fundamental research, which is really a bedrock of how American research universities work. We are engaged in fundamental research. So let me start with defining what it is. It is both basic and applied research in science and engineering, the results of which are ordinarily published and intended to be published and distributed broadly. That is a core principle, and it's been in place for a very long time. And that's how American universities largely operate. And I think our principal product, if you like, is not really IP, although that is generated as well, but it's really the students that we educate who become future leaders in areas of science and technology and part of the workforce that's needed in the United States. Now, with regards to China in particular, the United States over the last 25 years has benefited tremendously from international students from China and other nations that have been educated at American universities. And that is
70,000 Chinese doctorates. Chinese students, I think, have gotten doctorates in the US, if my numbers are right.
I think it's actually more than that, but it's of order 70,000 students at any particular time that are in graduate programs in the United States. And at my university, it's certainly a significant number. And I've actually had students myself from China who've worked on things like the detection of gravitational waves. So it's not that nobody's patented that yet, but it's a very important area of science. So this is really fundamental to American research universities. And I think the other aspect of fundamental research that's highlighted in the report is sort of, I think it goes back to what Peter Cowie said about start with heal thyself. I think the US has frankly become somewhat complacent in the support of research, R&D, and the rest of the world has actually invested more, and the US share of global R&D has dropped significantly over the last few decades. And that's in part because the rest of the world is now competitive and engaged in science and technology research. And that's not a bad thing, in my opinion. I think this is what the world needs to address what I consider, and I think is mentioned in our report, really two huge national security implications that every nation on this planet shares. One, we're just living through right now. How do we deal with pandemics? That's not going to be the last one. I hope it is, but it's not. How do we get ready for the next one? What do we do? And the other area is the broad subject of climate change and how do we transition to a sustainable economies and sustainable sources of energy. And those are shared by everybody on this planet. So I think that's sort of where I come from. If we're going to talk about national security, I would start with those two challenges. Now, having said that, there are challenges in the US-China relationship. And I think in part, American universities have to do a number of things, which they are doing, and they should do it regardless. And that is, we do have conflict of interest and conflict of commitment policies that really need to be clear and enforced by universities, and while avoiding needless red tape. That's highlighted in our report. Number two, and this applies broadly because research is becoming much more complex and the impacts are not always clearly appreciated, but we need to develop and have ethical standards for the conduct of research that are understood by faculty, staff, and students. And that is a principal responsibility of faculty at American universities and those universities to carry out. And that needs to happen. And
could you give us an example of unethical conduct that ought to be avoided, apart from, say, espionage?
There was a famous example of the so-called CRISPR babies, if you recall, from a few years ago.
Yes.
And I think in that case, the communities, both in the US and China, responded to that. The National Academy of Science in the US and the Chinese Academy of Science both stepped up and said, hey, we need to have a dialogue about this challenge and have ethical standards around that. So that was actually broadly the scientific community realizing we have to have ethical standards and they have to develop those. And that's a discussion that's underway and in progress. And there are other examples historically, the Asilomar conference from forgotten when it was. So I think there are a number of examples where it's not just governments, but it's the scientific community responding and developing ethical standards that they hold their peers to. And I think that's very important principle. So anyway, I should stop, and otherwise we're going to go over time, and
I'm happy to listen to you people all night because this is just fantastic stuff. It's your time I'm more concerned about. So with that, Professor Shirk, please take the floor, and thank you again for being here. Your microphone is muted.
I suggest we go to Helen Toner to talk about AI first, and then I'll go next.
Very good. Check. Yes, you're on.
Helen?
Great. Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to join you all and to be here live with everyone. So I wanted to briefly talk about the AI section of the report and what we found there. And I think there, the way that we applied the three principles that Peter Cowie described at the beginning really led us to thinking about the extent to which the US is already in a strong position when it comes to AI competitiveness, and looking at what are the sources of that strong position. What are the enduring advantages that the US has in AI? So I want to touch on those. I want to briefly, before I do that, just give a quick rundown of kind of what is artificial intelligence, because we hear that term thrown around so much, it can be easy to kind of lose track. Basically, artificial intelligence is a very broad term. It's been used since the 40s or 50s when we first started using computers. Basically means getting computers to do smart things. But what we've seen over the last 10 years or so, and the reason that we've started hearing this term AI more and more often in the last 5 years or so, is we've seen a big boom in one particular type of AI called machine learning, or especially deep learning or deep neural networks, which are essentially these really excellent pattern matchers. So they've turned out to be really great at a lot of problems that computers have traditionally struggled with, which includes tasks involving images, so recognizing images, sorting images, generating new images. They're also very good with sort of text and language, so speech to text like you can do on your phone, but also translation, also generating new text, new news articles and things like that. They're getting better and better at. These systems are also very good at games and problem solving. So you may remember in 2017 we had an AI system beat the world champion at the game of Go for the first time. A game that's considered much more complex than chess. And these same systems are also being increasingly used in robotics applications. And so in other words, AI is a name for a huge class of technologies that can do all kinds of different things. And so when we're thinking about making policy for AI or competing in AI, we mustn't just imagine a Terminator robot or imagine kind of Alexa in your living room. We really have to be aware that we need to treat it as a very broad set of technologies, or what economists would call a general purpose technology, which has applications across all kinds of sectors. So in thinking about how the Biden administration can ensure that the US stays competitive in this whole broad set of AI technologies, as I said, it really comes down to what the sources of enduring advantage for the United States are. And I want to pull out two of those that apply in particular to AI, which are human capital and semiconductors. So human capital, of course, people, talented scientists, researchers, engineers, is one of the most important inputs to having a strong AI ecosystem. I'd argue that it's a more important input than even data, for example. I'd be happy to talk more about data and China's access to data in the Q&A if that's of interest. And so human capital, of course, it means US domestic education, K through 12 education, computer science education, but it also has to include a high skill immigration piece. And this gets back to the comments just before about Chinese students in the US and the great benefits that they bring. If the US is being serious about long-term competition, it's just a fact that China's population is about 4 times the size of the United States. And so bringing in the best and brightest people from around the world is going to have to be a part of the plan. Luckily for the US, it turns out that many of the world's best and brightest do often want to come to the United States, for the great research universities, the political freedoms. It's a really nice place to live. So really, what the U.S. government needs to be doing at this point is making sure that it's possible for people to come, and that's certainly an area where the Trump administration really did some damage in terms of changing the legal immigration system in ways that made it much harder for folks to come over here. The second, so immigration has been historically a real advantage for the U.S., but I think the Biden administration will need to make sure to yeah, as Peter said, heal ourselves before long. The second advantage I want to talk about briefly is the semiconductor industry, which is a really big, complicated industry. It underlies kind of all of our digital technologies. And China has been pushing very hard to build its domestic semiconductor capacity. It's succeeded in some areas, especially in sort of older generations of chips, which are in many different types of products, cars and televisions and so on. But when it comes to the most advanced chips, the really cutting edge, the United States and its allies and partners, so especially Taiwan, Korea, the Netherlands, those countries do really have an edge in developing the most advanced chips. And so, we need to be very thoughtful about what to do with that edge and make sure that the US is coordinating with those allies and partners, not just, creating unilateral controls or sort of piece by piece policies to ensure that that any policies that are enacted there are actually going to work and are going to be to the advantage of the US and all those other countries. In the interest of staying brief, I'll suggest that interested listeners take a look at the report for our kind of specific examples in this area. But I hope that gives us a bit of a setup for the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, we're running a little bit slow for our listeners. We will accept your questions in a moment. There's a Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Please submit them in writing, and I will read them to the panelists. I've got a question for you, Ms. Toner, but I want to hear from Professor Shirk before we slow you down.
Well, that's fine. Thank you, David, for the opportunity to discuss our report with you and the audience this evening. So the Biden administration coming in after 4 years of a Trump administration, which actually did quite a bit of damage in US-China relations without achieving much in the way of positive progress from the standpoint of US interests, now faces the challenge of how to compete successfully with China without avoiding by avoiding a race to the bottom with China. In other words, we don't want to erect a lot of barriers and become more like China, but instead we want to become a better version of ourselves. But we need to do this in a way that involves a lot of very complex trade-offs between national security, competitiveness, the preservation of our own open society and our own innovation ecosystem. So, and this is, I have to say very frankly here that I still don't have a really clear idea of how the Biden administration is going about making these trade-offs. I think it's still finding its footing and figuring out how much of the restrictive efforts that the Trump administration had imposed on both technology sales from America to Chinese firms and imports of Chinese technology to the United States, the question of visas and talent, etc. I have to say that at this point, about 100 days into the Biden administration, we still don't really have a clear picture of how many of these restrictions are going to be sustained or expanded and how many are going to be reversed. So why is that? Well, one reason is that the Biden administration has put a premium on trying to reverse the misperceptions of Chinese and people in other countries as well, that the US is on the decline and is lacking in leverage vis-a-vis China. So a lot of what we've been doing for the last 100 days or so is working with friends and allies, re-engaging with multilateral institutions, getting control over the pandemic and vaccinating a large proportion of the American population, and really getting our own house in order with a pretty impressive speed, I would say. And of course, our stimulus recovery package, infrastructure legislation, all of these things are part of self-strengthening, and that very much aimed at reversing a mistaken image of the United States. And during this period, the Biden administration has quite intentionally not rushed to engage diplomatically with China, but wanting to be in a stronger position before it does that. So the question is, what happens next? And I have to say that now I'm going beyond our report. None of this, of course, is in the report because the report was written before the change in administrations. But the question now is, how do we effectively compete in science and technology with China while still sustaining what is really the greatest strengths of the American technological ecosystem, And here it goes back to a lot of what Helen has said about talent and human capital. And certainly it would be quite disastrous if the friction between the United States and China and vilifying China leads Chinese Americans to feel unwelcome in the United States and to have them no longer come here to study, to do research, and to contribute to America's progress. So I'll just say that I have some concerns because this period of kind of sustaining the tension in US-China relations, including more embargoing of sales to different kind of Chinese firms, kind of overly broad restrictions about imports from China, and no real change in the policies about visas and talent. And I'm hoping to see a greater clarity about the direction. I know many of the people in the Biden administration. I think they are very sensible, and I rely on their judgment to make the trade-offs in a way that's really best for US national interests and values, as well as for preserving the benefits of the global knowledge economy. Thank you.
Susan, thank you very much for that, and thank all of you. We are running over. I hope you'll stick around and take a few questions from listeners. I will abuse my privilege as moderator to ask some questions which I'm trying to understand. Susan, if I may, there seems to be a very sharp divide between, for example, views like Eric Schmidt and Bob Work, who wrote a report on artificial intelligence published, about a month ago, which said we really have to make sure we deny China access to cutting edge technology in semiconductors. That's pretty much everybody from the national security establishment and the Pentagon you read on this subject echoes this view. And then on April 5th, we had a report from the Semiconductor Industry Association, which, by the way, was prominently quoted by a senior official of Huawei yesterday, saying you've got to be out of your mind to try to tear apart the world's semiconductor supply chain. It'll cost you $1 trillion and give you a price increase of 40 to 60% in chips, and just have disastrous consequences. So the technologists seem to be saying that the restrictions are counterproductive, and the NatSec people seem to be saying they're necessary. Am I viewing this as a clear-cut split correctly? And if I am, which side do you think is right?
Well, if you're directing that question to me, I'm the wrong person to answer. So let's hear what Peter Cowie has to say about that, and Helen as well.
Right. So first of all, Bob Work endorsed our report. The split you're talking about may be a little artificial. What our report did endorse was, in fact, that the United States should use technology licensing controls and should look at the possibility of financial support for semiconductor manufacturing in the US to keep us at that leading edge that Helen described in her discussion of AI. That is not the same as saying that you should radically divorce the AI technology innovation system between the US and China. And it's not to say that the semiconductor industry can't have lots of bounds of interdependence. For example, for a lot of commodity chips, it's hard to see why having supplies out of China would necessarily be a problem. And more importantly, it's hard to see why the US, if it had a secure base for advanced control of the leading edge of semiconductors, would want to restrict chip sales to China. And in fact, what in our report we said is that with the proper set of controls and financial support for the US semiconductor industry, the US should have a relaxed view about the sale of chips to China. Now, there may be specific use cases that would call that into question, but as a broad policy stance, I think that that's a good starting point.
Peter, if I can direct a question towards you from the report.
David,
Please go ahead.
Helen, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add one very brief note there, which is I think in understanding these different perspectives and also the comments of, would this be tearing the supply chains apart? Would this raise prices? It's really important to distinguish between controls on chips, which, are sort of the finished product of the semiconductor industry, even though they have to then be built into later products, but the finished chips versus the equipment that is used to make the chips. And so I think the sort of strongest and clearest recommendations that I see coming from multiple sides, including both our report, the report by Eric Schmidt and Bob Work and others, and colleagues of mine at CSET as well, I should say, is to be looking at the most sophisticated machinery used to manufacture the most advanced chips, which is currently very, very concentrated. There's certain machines that are only produced by, one single company is able to make that machine. And so those controls are one thing. And all that does is displace where the production is happening. So it doesn't actually lead to price changes. It doesn't lead to industry harms, which is very different from preventing, from kind of wide bans on China purchasing chips. So I just wanted to put in that little bit of nuance there as well.
No, thank you. The questions I have are kind of in the too little, too late department. So, for example, one of the things which we've been batting around in Asia Times for months is there really an alternative to the kind of prepackaged 5G box base station that Huawei and Ericsson produced? Your report recommended the so-called software solution, the Open Radio Access Network. That's been heavily criticized by a number of people in the technology community, partly because they think it'll take too long and be too expensive. But the thing I perceive happening with Huawei is they're running around the world building 5G systems in Turkey and Malaysia, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, all kinds of places that just are never going to do O-RAN because they don't have the engineers to do it. They want someone to give them a box they can put in a lamppost and will give them 5G. Isn't the risk, pardon me for the leading question, isn't the risk of going with the O-RAN approach that we cede very large parts of the world to the Chinese in terms of 5G build out?
So my answer is there is no way that Huawei won't be competitive in a lot of markets where networks are primarily interested in, as you say, a solution out of a box at low cost with reasonable effectiveness. But that is a solution that basically is not effective for what is going to be the future of 5G and its successor generations, which has to be a much more customized network. And the fact that the premium networks in the higher income countries are willing to buy in significantly as lead customers for O-RAN and vRAN solutions tells you a lot about this story. Also, if I can say so, I have spent a fair amount of my professional career dealing with issues of mobile technology and computing. And in mobile technology, vendors with established market positions go out and will sell the story that they find most compatible with their next sales cycle. And there is a lot of information being floated out there by established vendors saying, well, not so sure about O-RAN and vRAN. And why? Well, it's because their equipment is not that. And as I indicated, the real bet that I think the US should be making is not an unusual bet. Everything that we know from computing and other digital technologies over the last 20 years is that basically software, advanced semiconductors, and now cloud computing infrastructures eat the traditional hardware markets and commodify them. So now we're going to have a market that, in my view, where there's going to be Huawei equipment of the traditional nature.